Andrew Feinstein, good to see you and thank you for your time.
Great to be with you.
As we see the violent deterioration of the situation in Gaza, the lack of political progress, the inability of the international system to bring its weight to bear on the outcome, you focus on the inordinate volume of weaponry that has been funneled to Israel by democratic governments around the world. What exactly is it that you found?
Well, the biggest supplier of weaponry to Israel, much of which is being used in Gaza as we speak, comes from the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and then the countries of the European Union. And the reality is that according to the national laws of all of those countries and multilateral arms export controls like the EU Common Position and the UN's International Arms Trade Treaty, those are all being violated by these arms sales because civilians are being killed with these weapons. And what it simply reflects is how out of control the global arms trade is, and how a country like Israel that has these political alliances can effectively do what it wants with as much military equipment as it wants. The United States of America announced 2 or 3 days ago that it is going to be sending an additional $730 million of weapons to Israel while Israel continues to kill civilians in Gaza.
That was pretty much my next question, right? The $735 million in weapons sales approved by the Biden administration a week before Hamas started firing rockets into Israel. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace says through 2020, the United States has provided Israel with $146 billion in military, economic, and missile defense funding, making Israel the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. assistance since World War II. What are your thoughts on what many frame as the obvious contradiction, right? The chief mediator to this conflict is essentially arming one of the parties to that conflict to the teeth.
It is morally indefensible what the United States is doing. It is morally indefensible what Israel is doing. But the reality is that without the military and diplomatic support of the United States of America, Israel could not be killing innocent civilians in Gaza as you and I are speaking. And, I say this to you as a very proud South African who was involved in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I say this to you as a Jew whose mother survived the Holocaust in occupied Vienna, who lost 39 members of her family in the death camps. I say this as someone who introduced the first ever motion on Holocaust denial in the South African Parliament's history. That what is happening in the occupied territories today, undertaken by Israel, and enabled and facilitated by Britain, America especially, and countries of the European Union, is morally repugnant and indefensible. And if they had an iota of human decency, they would force Israel into an immediate ceasefire, they would stop arming Israel, and they would impose sanctions on the Israeli government.
Andrew, you tweeted earlier today, you want people to realize that the senior political, military, and corporate leaders benefit personally from these arms deals, or at least their parties do. Just speak to just how deep this goes.
Well, let's talk about Joe Biden, who's just announced this $735 million arms deal with Israel, which is literally to stamp on the bodies of dead civilians in Gaza. The reality is that Joe Biden, his political party, the Democrats, his political campaign was funded by companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, et cetera, all of the companies who are going to make billions in profits from the arms deals that he is doing with Israel. So the role of politicians who sometimes illegally and corruptly themselves receive money, most famously, Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark Thatcher, was paid £12 million in bribes on a deal between the UK and Saudi Arabia. In the US, it's slightly more open in that we can trace who donates to which parties. Joe Biden will benefit materially from these arms sales. So the way in which the global arms trade is organized and the way in which our out-of-control militarism manifests in places like Gaza, Yemen, etc., is that this little elite benefit politically and benefit materially from the arms deals that they do. And it's why I describe the global arms trade as counting its profits in billions and its costs in human lives.
Let me jump in. We are seeing some consternation, certainly within the Democratic Party today, within the Democratic caucus in Congress. What do you make of this rupture we are now seeing among Democrats in the main? The Republican Party is, of course, a completely different conversation. And whether this could, Andrew, fundamentally shift the military and political relationship with Israel. You're hearing from the likes of Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York. What do you make of this rupture? It's new.
A small minority of progressive Democrats are speaking out about Israel's actions like perhaps we have never heard before. And I think this is perhaps the beginning of an increase in intolerance with the way Israel behaves. Israel is still engaged in what is an illegal and very brutal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Now, there are very few countries in the world that speak out regularly and explicitly about this. I'm glad to say South Africa is one of them. But we are seeing both in the United States of America and in Europe, perhaps more than usual, we are seeing politicians who are troubled by what Israel is doing. Unfortunately, none of those politicians are near to actual seats of power. And unfortunately, those who are in those seats of power are continuing to enable and facilitate the bloodshed and mayhem that we're seeing in Gaza and Yemen.
Israel, of course, argues that its geographic location puts it in a region that places its security and therefore its need for sophisticated weaponry and weapon systems at a premium. What do you make of that argument?
Well, if you're not prepared to make peace, yes, it does. But if you're actually committed to a meaningful peace process, which no Israeli government has been for years and years now, then you are making your neighborhood an extremely dangerous and difficult one. And then, of course, you would need the weaponry. But the reality is, Costa Rica, a country that during the 1980s and early 1990s was in an extremely dangerous neighborhood, if you will, doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a military because it has made peace with all of its neighbors and it runs its country in a very particular way. It is exactly the opposite to the way Israel functions. Israel is politically and to a large degree economically dependent on warfare and militarism. There is no material interest in Israel seeking peace. And that's one of the biggest problems at the moment. And it's a problem that only the United States and Israel's other allies can change.
Allow me to broaden the conversation just a little bit. An official with conflict armament research told the Security Council last year that the illicit flow of small arms was like attempting to control the spread of an infectious disease without understanding its origins or transmission vectors. They identify government failure, Andrew, to secure weapons against theft and looting, the falsifying of export control documents, and the deliberate supply by states of weapons to rebel, insurgent, and terrorist forces. Would you agree that this, to a large extent, has been at the heart of the inability of the African Union to silence the guns by their 2020 deadline?
Absolutely. I think that there is a complete lack of political will, be it in Africa, all the rest of the world. This is not unique to Africa. There is a complete lack of political will by our political leaders to silence the guns, because there are many, many ways in which we could, as Carr itself has said in time. For instance, there are manufacturers of ammunition who manage to put traces on every single bullet, let alone armament that they sell. Why do we not insist that this has to be the case on every weapon, on every piece of ammunition that is produced anywhere in the world, so less innocent people die around the world?
I mean, I'll tell you why, and I'll quote you. The reality of the arms trade is that it's by far the most corrupt trade in the world.
And the most lucrative for those in political power, very sadly.
Let me ask you this final question. I want to briefly touch on the upcoming corruption trial of former South African President Jacob Zuma later this month. I know you'll be testifying in that trial, so I don't expect us to get into the weeds in this discussion here. But you said that the arms deal in South Africa was the moment the African National Congress and South Africa's young democracy lost its moral compass. I'll let you have the final word.
That was said by the editor of the Mail and Guardian at the time, but I endorse it absolutely, completely. South Africa's arms deal, in which 5 European countries and Britain sold tens of millions of dollars of weaponry to our new democracy, facing enormous socio-economic challenges, and the realization by my own party, the ANC, that the party could benefit and that many of the leaders of the party could benefit personally as a consequence of the deal, was the point at which we realized that we could loot the state for party and personal gain. And the trial of Jacob Zuma and many others to follow him, I hope, is the point at which we start to reclaim our democracy in South Africa.
I know you were supposed to be on a plane. Was it today or yesterday? What's your itinerary looking at right now?
I was meant to still be on a plane on my way to South Africa to give evidence in Pietermaritzburg tomorrow morning, but that has now obviously been delayed. Jacob Zuma, for someone who has said publicly for over a decade now that he wants his day in court, has spent a remarkable amount of money and a remarkable amount of time trying to avoid having to spend his day in court. But that day in court will come.
Andrew Feinstein, safe travels, and thanks so much for making time for us.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Feinstein is one of the world's leading experts on corruption and the global arms trade, a former MP of the African National Congress and author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade.
Indeed, not mincing his words there with Sherwin. Thank you for bringing that to us, Sherwin, and we'll follow Andrew Feinstein's testimony when he does get to the stand in South Africa.